Leonie, from my side, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Obviously, around parental alienation, it's one of those things that I think is very, very often misunderstood, and it often has the tendency to become almost a political debate between people. You know, you get different camps of people who believe, you know, that there is or there isn't, or it's a myth or it's not, etc., etc. So what I'd like to achieve today in our discussion is to get your opinion, you know, as a social worker who's in active practice, who specializes in this type of thing, and get some guidance. You know, obviously, I know that one can't dispense advice or formal legal or mental health advice in a type of a setting like this. You know, those are things that need to be considered very clinically and in a very, very structured scientific manner. For today's purposes, however, obviously we're not doing that. I would like to pick your brain, as it were, and try and simplify it for practitioners to know, you know, just an extent of, you know, what is the nature of the beast of parental alienation, and how does one handle it? You know, not all of us are going to put our hands up and do therapy in these types of cases, but I think it's so important across professions that people understand what is it not, and what to look out for.
Right. Look, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, but second of all, you're quite correct. It is a complex topic, and I agree with you. One can't just jump in and say, oh, this is a case of alienation. One has to be very careful. There are a lot of reasons, and perhaps we can discuss some of them, why a child will resist contact with a parent. And I believe it's just reckless to immediately take one set of behaviors and label it as parental alienation. It's become too easy. It's become the flavor of the day. Oh, it's parental alienation. One has to do a thorough assessment and maybe have a checklist of what is parental alienation and what isn't before we make that diagnosis.
Absolutely. And look, I like the fact that you use the word diagnosis, because I think it really implies that one needs to have a specialized skill set as a mental health professional, either as a social worker or a psychologist, obviously, to really come to grips with, is this alienation or is it not? Or is it something that one can kind of just off the cuff say, yes, it is, or no, it isn't?
You're quite right. One can't. I think it's irresponsible to just simply, you know, make that conclusion without a thorough investigation and discussion with peers, colleagues. You know, I think it's always helpful to bounce it off someone else to check. Yeah.
Absolutely. My next question, I think, revolves around the issue of, you know, the term parental alienation, because I know it's also had numerous names throughout the years. Obviously, we started off with parental alienation, then parental alienation syndrome, and I believe to a large extent internationally these have fallen out of favor to an extent.
Well, yes and no. That's part of the difficulty with parental alienation. There isn't one set definition of what parental alienation is. Different researchers define it differently. Basically, it's when a child is brainwashed by one parent to reject the other parent, to fear them, to believe that that parent doesn't love them and that parent's harmful for them. And then the child rejects that parent for no justifiable reason. But if you look at like 5 different researchers, they'll give you 5 different definitions. But parental alienation, that term is used today throughout the world. It's accepted in many countries throughout the world as a form of psychological child abuse. But there are detractors who say there's no such thing as parental alienation.
Yeah. Absolutely. I must say I'm quite partial myself to the 2016 definition, Burnett, Wambold, and Narrow, where they say parental alienation refers to a child's reluctance to have a relationship with a parent without good reason. I like this twofold approach. The child doesn't want to have a relationship, and there must be no good reason for it. And it's very child-focused, isn't it?
Well, it is indeed, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, because I think it's important to also to include the fact that the child is not is resisting that parent for no good reason. They don't have a good reason. They had a prior good relationship with that child, with that parent, sorry, and suddenly they refuse to to have any contact, or reluctant to have any contact with that parent.
Absolutely. And that term reluctance, I think, is very, very important. That's one of the names that we're really seeing popping up these days, is contact refusal and reluctance, isn't it?
Yeah, and they call it contact refusal and resistance often.
Resistance, my apologies.
Yeah.
Okay. You've highlighted something very, very interesting, Leonie, and that's this element of there having been a positive relationship prior, and then it's as if a switch is flipped and all of a sudden there is this contact refusal. Can you perhaps tell me a bit more about that in the context of an alienation scenario?
Well, a parent who's been an active, loving parent suddenly finds themselves in a position where the child is refusing to have any contact with them, and they can't understand this. What happened? Before the split, they were going to the movies together, they were having birthday parties together. Now the child won't take a call from them, refuses any gifts from them, won't see them for no valid reason.
Sure. That's very, very tragic. And what are the ways in which this would start manifesting? I mean, what are the things that one needs to look out for in saying, not this is parental alienation, but this might be parental alienation. Let's get a professional involved.
Look, I think one has to first, as I say, perhaps have a checklist. Is this a case of normal age-appropriate separation anxiety? We see this often with little ones under the age of 6. They find it hard to separate from a parent. So they'll cry, I don't want to go, please don't make me go. And often when they do go, in fact, most often when they go, they're actually fine. They settle down and they'll be fine. It's the same at school. They cry when they have to separate from a parent at school. So one has to look at, is it that? Is it age-appropriate separation anxiety? Some kids just get anxious at the thought of transferring from one parent to another, and then when they're there, they're fine. So one has to look at, what do we do at transitions? How do we make transitions easier for that child so they don't have that anxiety? Then we have anxious children who are older children who also don't want to find it difficult to separate from a parent. And they may have different reasons. They may have an anxiety disorder or be highly anxious children. They also may be worried that, what's going to happen to my parents when I leave that parent? When I go to dad for the weekend, is mom going to cope? Maybe mom's alcoholic, maybe mom's a drug addict, maybe mom suffers from depression, and all these kind of things may play on the child's mind. If I'm not there, will dad start drinking? If I'm not there, will mom not get out of bed in the morning? So that's also a reason, that's also one of the things that one has to look at. We have to consider, has a child formed an affinity to the one parent? Now, affinity is where they share an emotional bond because it could be because of their gender, it could be because they share similar interests, it could be because they've spent more time with that parent. Has that child formed an alignment to a parent? An alignment is where one could roughly say they take sides with a parent, with one parent. And that normally happens, we see it quite often in adolescence, where they get quite angry if the one parent, they know that the one parent has stopped paying maintenance or pays too little maintenance or has had an affair or is getting remarried. They will take a side with the one parent. Also, some children do that when it's too hard for them to choose, when they put in the middle of their parents' conflict and they have to choose one or the other. So in order to just get out of that conflict psychologically, they choose one parent, usually the parent that they feel safer with, that they'll know that parent won't reject them, and sort of reject the other parent. Then we also have stubborn children who just absolutely refuse to go. Now, the stubbornness doesn't rise to the level of a disorder, but they just refuse. And it's usually kids who are quite spoiled, who are used to getting their own way, or who've been overly empowered. They're allowed to make decisions that they're not really, mature enough to make. And then we get estrangement. Now, it's really, really important to be able to distinguish what is estrangement and what is alienation, because they're two different things. Now, estrangement happens when a child rejects a parent for a good, valid, solid reason, such as that parent may be abusive towards the child. They may have witnessed domestic violence or been involved in the domestic violence in the home. That parent may be a substance abuser, so their parenting is inept. That parent may be neglectful, chronic neglect of the child. I recently had a case where I had to hear the voice of a 15-year-old boy who didn't want to go to his dad. He was referred to me by the children's court, and it emerged in my interviews with him that the father had actually physically kicked this child, punched him, hit him, tied his hands with cable ties. Okay, now that is a valid reason for not wanting to go to your father. Okay, so I raised this in court to say, but this is abuse. Why hasn't the magistrate reported this as a form of abuse? No, says the magistrate to me. You are going to see this child for therapy. That was. Now, I'm standing there. I'm just a social worker. I can't argue with the magistrate. I tried to put my case forward, but it was just hopeless.
Yeah, sure. It's very, very sad. I think this aspect of parental estrangement is something where a lot of false conclusions are often jumped to, and I think it becomes a locus of control kind of scenario where the parent simply blames factors outside of themselves for the fact that the child doesn't want to see them, whereas they need to actually commit some introspection, and then they could start working through. I'm not saying that that's in all cases. Obviously, I'm not a parental alienation denier. I think the middle ground, unfortunately, that attorneys specifically, and I speak only from my experience in my profession, need to walk is twofold. It's on the one side not to label everything alienation unnecessarily, and on the other side not to disregard the legitimate cases of alienation. And I think that's a difficult distinction to make. And are there any tips, for practitioners to start distinguishing between these things without going into too much depth?
Okay. I would say to your client, who will be the parent, obviously, will come and say, either my child doesn't want to go or my child has refused to go, and get a history from them. How involved have you been with this child? What has the relationship been like with this child? What have you done? What do you like to do together? Has there been any violence? Has there been any, times where in the marriage your child didn't want to be with you? Did you take the child to the doctor? Those kind of things. Get the involvement. Try to get a history of the involvement with that child, their parenting with of that child. I think that would be helpful to assess, does this child have a valid reason? You know, have you ever hurt the child or that sort of thing? And I think you must be blatant and ask them. You know, one has to be direct and, you know, establish that.
Absolutely.
You know, Mervyn, we also get children who become enmeshed with the parents who refuse to go to the other parent. Now, enmeshment is when a child and a parent kind of become one. There's no boundary between them. You don't know where the one begins and the other ends. And a good example of this is when you see the child will say to you, we don't like him. We don't need him. We do very well without him, thank you very much. And you're not going to force us to have a relationship. They talk as one. Sometimes it's confusing to distinguish between a child who's got a very loving, warm relationship with the parent, with a child who has an enmeshed relationship, because a child will come into your office with the parent, jump onto the parent's lap, wind their arm around the parent's neck, and you think, oh, what a lovely, loving, warm relationship. But in fact, there may be an enmeshment. I think I had a perfect example earlier this week. A little girl, I was seeing assessing a little girl, and I said, tell me about what you like to do with you and your mom. She said, everything. She said, let me tell you something. My mom is the ice cream, and I am the chocolate sauce on top. We are the perfect. She said, we are the perfect deal. Now, you know, if you don't look carefully, you may think, wow, this is great. They've got such a wonderful relationship.
Yeah, sure. And it turns out it's enmeshment. Now, enmeshment in and of itself, Leonie, and I think what I'd like to talk to you about is distinguishing alienation and alienating behaviors, because the one is not necessarily the other. Where does enmeshment fit in? Is it alienation in and of itself, or how does that work?
It's a separate entity, but it often occurs in conjunction with alienation. So and when it does occur with an alienation, we call it a hybrid case. So it's not pure alienation and it's not pure enmeshment, but they often, as a result of the alienation, you know, they often become enmeshed, or it can be enmeshment prior to the separation. They've always had an enmeshed relationship with one another. But just to speak to your question about alienating behaviors, they're not the same. Okay. You can have alienating behaviors such as I said, interfering with telephone contact or withholding contact, but it doesn't necessarily mean, or gatekeeping, it doesn't necessarily mean alienation. And when one gets to gatekeeping, it's very important to distinguish the reasons for gatekeeping, because sometimes you have protective gatekeeping.
Yeah. Okay.
And that doesn't constitute alienation.
So what are the different types of gatekeeping? Could you give me a bit more information on that? Because that's something one sees, and I've seen it in a lot of reports in matters that I've dealt with, you know, and the experts in those cases talk about gatekeeping, but I haven't seen that there's a distinction, and I'd love to understand that a bit better.
Well, there's open gatekeeping where, you know, the parent allows a child to move up and down. There's restrictive where they don't always let them go, and not for a good reason, sometimes for spiteful reasons. They say you can't have the child. And then there's facilitative gatekeeping, that they will, you know, assist in the child going to the other parent. And then there's protective gatekeeping. So if there's been an abuse or the mother is afraid, or a parent is afraid if they let the child go to the other parent, the child may come to harm because that parent's not capable of looking after that child properly for a number of reasons. I mean, that's just very simple. It's a little bit more complex.
No, absolutely. Keep it simple, please. It's humble attorneys most probably who are going to watch this. Mere mortals, as we say, you know. So gatekeeping is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, if for example, protective gatekeeping, protecting a child from harm for legitimate reasons, I suppose that also makes it so difficult to ascertain, because very often it's factual questions, and very often the factual questions have to be answered by the children, who are in and of themselves potentially compromised as witnesses, or am I missing something in terms of that?
No, you know, it's not simple with children. I think one's got to be very careful, because there's plenty of research. I think CECI did a lot of research on how easy it is to convince children of things that haven't happened, or to implant false memories into children. So I think one must be very careful who speaks to the children. Are they properly trained? Are they a mental health practitioner, a psychologist, a social worker? And I think children, I understand that the Act says that you have to hear their voices, and I agree one has to. But it doesn't mean you necessarily give them choices. And it also, one has to look at other things, such as their level of maturity. I don't believe that a child, however a 10-year-old may be, has the cognitive capacity to understand what are the ramifications for me in the future if I reject a parent now. I don't believe that child can.
Absolutely. And incidentally, I've always held the view that, you know, it almost becomes unfair to the child to give them too much power, because now they have to choose between mom and dad, or risk ostracizing the one in favor of the other. I think that must be an immense toll on the conscience of a little mite of 10, 11 years.
It is. Now, Amy Baker did a big retrospective study of adults who were alienated as children. And many of them, I can't remember the exact percentage, but many of them said they regretted saying that they didn't want to see their other parent, and they wished that the psychologists and social workers who had interviewed them could see through them and didn't believe what they had said.
That's very interesting. Sure.
Yeah.
You know, hindsight is always 20/20, and I suppose, you know, I don't want to give the legislator too little credit. I mean, if one looks at the wording of the Act, we look at the age, maturity, and stage of development, and we have to have regard to that. In the lens of that, you know, I want to use a quote, and I won't use my dear friend who made the quote's name in vain, but they made a statement that has stuck with me, and they basically said, you know, in alienation cases, a voice of the child interview is absolutely meaningless. What would your view be on that?
100%, because you're not hearing the genuine voice. This is a corrupt voice. This is a child who's been coached. This is a child who's been brainwashed. That's not their genuine thinking. You can't. You actually, I agree 100%. One should never hear the voice of an alienated child.
Sure.
It's not authentic. It's not real.
And I suppose that is also why it is so important, and I risk making a lot of our viewers very cross by saying this, but doesn't that make it so critical that your voice of the child be done by a mental health practitioner?
Well, I would say yes. I would absolutely say yes. I think that when it comes to making decisions about children's future, judges should have a mental health practitioner at their side to confer with them before they make these court orders.
I agree with you 100%. I've actually seen, and I think one of the big places where this kind of slipped in is on the I think it's the commentary to the Children's Act, Darfel and Skelton's one, and they speak of the different ways in which a court can hear a child's views. And one of those is, and I think it comes all the way back from Solar, if I'm not mistaken, way back in the day, that a judge can actually speak to the children in chambers, or a magistrate for that matter. And I think there are inherent risks. I've had a matter where there was an allegation of alienation, and the client eventually decided to rather pursue the matter on his own. And the matter came to a head on one occasion when the magistrate said, well, let me speak to the child. The child went into chambers and the child said, look, I want nothing to do with my dad. Now, the question is not whether the child was justified in saying, I want nothing to do with my dad or not, whether it was an estrangement or an alienation case. The question is this, is a magistrate, and I say this with utmost respect to the judiciary, capable of really making an informed decision based on the voice of the child, bearing in mind that there may be an element of alienation. And it's an interesting point for discussion, and I won't obviously ask you to give too much comment on that, Leonie. I know it's quite a contentious issue, but it certainly is food for thought. The fact that we need people who have a mental health background. Alternatively, our judges and our magistrates need to be equipped to start understanding these things. There's that beautiful article, which I believe you forwarded to me a while back, about a group giving a handbook out to judges in the States on alienation. I mean, would that we had the resources to do that in South Africa, because it really is an extremely and extraordinarily complex topic. It's not simple. Let's talk about contact refusal from a parent. I've seen numerous cases where jurists, attorneys, advocates, and even presiding officers have said, well, parent one is refusing contact with parent two. This is now alienation. What are your thoughts on that? What kind of role does contact refusal by a parent play in alienation?
Well, I think it's just one of many aspects. It's not the only one. It might be a very significant one, but it's not the only one. And I think you cannot just take one element and say, well, that's it. We've got to look at many factors, possible hypotheses. Is it this? Is it that? Is it this? Is it something else as well? You can't just jump to that conclusion.
Absolutely. And I think one must be very careful. What are some of the other alienation strategies that you've encountered? Obviously without making too much reference to matters. I don't want to compromise you as an expert. What have you seen over the years?
Look, I think, withholding information, not letting the child be available, so the father or the mother will phone to speak to the child's sleeping, the child's eating, the child's playing. As bad mouthing not only the parent but the extended family, not sharing information, not telling the other parent that there's a prize giving or school sports, or putting that parent's name on the child's list of people to contact, not sharing medical information.
Sure.
That's quite a big one as well.
And there's one thing I've been dying to ask you about. And I didn't mention to you that I would ask this, so please do forgive me. But I've heard at one stage someone spoke about the free thinker phenomenon. What is that? Is that something that you've encountered, or is it just something that I may have heard out of turn?
I've heard that as well, but I don't think that I'm equipped to answer that. I don't think I have enough, knowledge or information to give a.
I think the what that really boils down to is this whole phenomenon of a child saying, I formulated these ideas myself. I don't want to see my dad, and that's my decision. Is that something you see very frequently?
Often. Nobody told me. I've got my own brain. I've got my own mind. Do you think I'm stupid? That's they say it quite arrogantly, but yeah.
There's a, not to make light of it, there's a very, very sad extract. I'm just looking on my iPad here on the left from Sola, which goes back all the way to 2003. That case is old enough to drive a car at this stage, where Judge Kathy Satchwell said, "I'm reluctantly compelled to accept that Kay is uncontrollable when it comes to the issue of custody. He has made up his mind and will not be deterred by his mother, the courts, or threats of custodial care." Now, obviously, the term custody, this was pre-Children's Act, but very, very interesting how what the judge established there already really is a theme that's gone through. She kind of hit the nail on the head as far back as 19 years ago. And that arrogance, I suppose, is a very, very interesting thing, because one of the things that Sola found was that there's an absence of guilt in terms of the child's behavior. They absolutely believe this person is bad and I can behave however I want towards them.
You see, what you're describing now is what Gardner also spoke about, the 8 characteristics of an alienated child. You see, this arrogance, this lack of guilt. I'm an independent thinker. I made up my mind myself. Nobody's told me to say this. Don't you think I have my own brain? I've had 10-year-olds saying to me, I'm 10, and I can make up my own mind. And I've said, well, you're really quite old, but do you drive a car? And they said, this little girl said, no. Can you get married? No, well, you're 10.
I love the adage of, go out, get a job, change the world while you're 10 and you still know everything.
Exactly. So, I think perhaps what you are calling a free thinker, I would call an independent thinker.
Perhaps I had a misnomer. Look, absolutely. And I think that's very important. The child believes that they created these thoughts themselves rather than having it implanted.
Yeah. Well, you see, they've also become overly empowered in many ways. The parent allows them to make decisions, treats them as an adult, confides in them, often, and this is also alienating behaviors, by the way, sharing information about the divorce with that child, telling the child why they got divorced in the first place. Your father or your mother's had an affair. Your father or your mother's alcoholic. Your father or your mother doesn't look after you properly or pay enough maintenance. These are adults' things, that information that shouldn't be shared with a child. A child shouldn't be burdened with it. And now you elevated them to the role of an adult as an equal to the parent.
Yeah, I had a matter years back. It was very tragic. Every time a letter would be sent to the opposing attorneys, my client's son would phone him and say, "Wat skryf jy nou weer vir my ma?"
Yeah, exactly.
And it's very sad, as you say, it's children should not be embroiled in adult things. Yeah. What are your views in terms of people who are not mental health practitioners? So I'm not going to go into the potential treatment of alienation. That is something extremely contentious at this stage. And I think it's outside of the scope of our discussion. But, for attorneys and mediators who suspect that there may be alienation, what would you say are the top to-dos and the top do-not-dos, in conclusion?
Okay, to-dos is to go through the list and look at possible reasons for other than alienation for the rejection. Do not immediately jump to the conclusion because you've identified one or two alienating behaviors that this is a case of alienation. You've got to be able to distinguish, is it an extreme case of all these alienating behaviors? Plus, you take into consideration that, as I said earlier on, the prior relationship. Was there a good, positive prior relationship? The absence of of abuse, all those kind of things before you come to a conclusion. And I would say to a mediator, with all due respect, I mean, I'm a mediator. Confer with someone, confer with a mental health practitioner, the same way as I would ask you, Mervyn, if there was a legal issue that I'm not 100% certain about. We all, we're all in this together. We all need to be supporting and helping one another. That's the only way we can render decent service to our clients.
Absolutely.
So I would say, and I'm always happy. I'm not saying I'm the expert, come to me all the time, but I'm saying I'm always happy and available to talk through with a colleague or a mediator and say, have you done this? Let's look at this. What have you done? Just so you get a good result for the child and for the parent, because alienation has terrible, terrible consequences for the child and for the alienated parent.
Absolutely. I think you've touched on something incredibly important there, Leonie, is that we have a very, very wide knowledge base of different professions and how important it is for the professions to speak to one another and understand that we can't all be experts in the same things. That would be a boring old world, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's important to work collaboratively. It doesn't make you any lesser or better than because you're conferring with someone or discussing with someone.
Leonie, from my side, I really want to sincerely thank you for giving of your time and your expertise to share the absolute wealth of knowledge you have on this. And I really look forward to sharing this with the others on the platform and to get their input as well, to get a bit of a discussion going. But I really do appreciate it. And thank you. That really is all I can say. And I think I must take my hat off to you because this is certainly not work for the faint of heart, is it?
Definitely not. It's not something that I would recommend lightly to a friend.
I tend to ask any candidate attorneys in their first interview, what have you decided to do with your life? Run. Thank you so much. I think there's such scope.
It was useful.
It was absolutely. I really appreciate it. I think there's so much good that can come of professions working collaboratively in these types of things and better serving family units. So, Leonie, I'm going to stop the recording now and thank you so much once again.
Yes, and please edit.
The information contained in this video is distributed free of charge for educational purposes. Whilst we have taken all reasonable steps to ensure that the information contained herein is correct and up to date, insofar as the law in South Africa is concerned, the law remains a nuanced and complex field of study, replete with many exceptions and conditions. Please, therefore, do not utilize this information as legal advice, which it is not. When in doubt, consult with a legal professional. For more information, please feel free to contact our offices.